She picked up a stranger at the hotel bar to spite her cheating ex. But the man who traced fire down her spine in the penthouse suite was the Vampire King, and Monday morning, her ex would kneel before his new boss. The key turned in the lock like a blade twisting in her chest, and Sophia Chen stepped into what had been their sanctuary for 2 years, only to find Marcus tangled in Egyptian cotton sheets with Vivian Cross from accounting. The late afternoon sun slanted through their bedroom windows, casting everything in golden mockery as clothes scattered across hardwood floors told the story she had refused to see. Marcus scrambled upright, his dark hair disheveled in ways that had once made her pulse quicken, now making her stomach revolt. Vivian pulled the sheet to her chin with practiced ease, her red lips curved in satisfaction rather than shame, and Sophia realized this was not the first time their bed had hosted this particular betrayal. The silence stretched between them like a wire about to snap, until Marcus cleared his throat and said the words that would shatter her world completely. He had been planning to leave for months, he explained with clinical detachment, timing his departure with his promotion to senior analyst at Blackthorn Industries, a company so exclusive that even mentioning the interview process required signed confidentiality agreements. Vivian would be transferring there too, he added, her fingers already intertwined with his, as if claiming territory Sophia had foolishly believed was hers alone. The confrontation erupted with volcanic fury as Sophia swept his belongings from dresser tops, watching cologne bottles and cufflinks crash against walls in symphonies of destruction. Glass fragments caught the dying light like fallen stars as Marcus dodged a particularly well-aimed picture frame, the one from their anniversary dinner where his smile had seemed so genuine, she had believed in forever. Rain began to streak the windows in patterns that mimicked the tears she refused to shed, each droplet a witness to the dissolution of everything she had built her life around. 2 years of shared meals, whispered secrets, and planned futures crumbled into lies as Marcus gathered his scattered possessions with the efficiency of someone who had already mentally moved out months ago. The apartment felt hollow now, echoing with phantom laughter from dinner parties and movie nights that had apparently meant nothing to the man she thought she knew. When Marcus finally left, taking his key and his promises with him, Sophia stood alone in the wreckage of their life together, surrounded by broken glass and the suffocating scent of Vivian's perfume. In the closet hung a black cocktail dress, tags still attached, that she had purchased for their anniversary celebration next week, now a cruel reminder of how thoroughly she had been played. The fabric felt like liquid shadow between her fingers as she pulled it from its hanger, its sleek lines promising transformation from victim to something far more dangerous. Hours later, Sophia stood before the marble facade of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel, its golden lights blazing against the storm-darkened sky like a beacon for the desperate and reckless. Her credit card slid through the reader with the satisfying click of financial rebellion as she booked a suite that would consume half her savings. But tonight money meant nothing compared to the intoxicating freedom of self-destruction. The elevator carried her upward with silent efficiency, depositing her into a world of crystalline elegance, where every surface reflected light like captured fire. The hotel bar stretched before her like an altar to beautiful excess, its mahogany surfaces polished to mirror perfection, while amber lighting transformed even the most ordinary patrons into creatures of mystery and allure. Sophia ordered whiskey, neat, something she had never drunk before tonight, but which seemed appropriate for becoming someone she had never been. The liquid burned her throat like liquid courage as her phone buzzed incessantly with Marcus's attempts to explain, to minimize, to somehow make his betrayal sound reasonable. She powered the device off with savage satisfaction, severing the last connection to the woman who had been naive enough to trust in promises, and forever. Then she saw him watching her from across the room, and the air itself seemed to shift like the moment before lightning strikes. He was tall, with the kind of darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, his black hair perfectly styled despite the late hour. his suit tailored with European precision that spoke of wealth so profound it had become unconscious. But it was his eyes that held her captive, pale gray like winter storms, catching and reflecting the bar's amber glow with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. He moved toward her with predatory grace, each step calculated and fluid, as if he owned not just the expensive suit he wore, but the very air around him. When he stopped beside her bar stool, she caught his scent, something that reminded her of midnight rain and dangerous promises, completely unlike Marcus's safe cologne that had always smelled like suburban comfort and small ambitions. His voice, when he spoke, carried the faintest trace of an accent she could not place, cultured and old-world elegant, as he offered to buy her next drink with a smile that suggested he was accustomed to getting whatever he desired. Sophia found herself nodding before rational thought could intervene, drawn by something that felt like fate, or madness, or the intoxicating possibility of revenge, served cold and beautiful. He introduced himself simply as Damien, no last name offered, no explanation for why someone clearly worth millions was alone in a hotel bar on a Tuesday night. His attention felt like standing too close to fire, warming and dangerous in equal measure as he listened to her speak without asking probing questions about her obvious distress. Instead, he told her stories that seemed lifted from fairy tales, adventures in cities she had only read about, business deals that shaped entire economies, all delivered with the casual ease of someone for whom the extraordinary had become mundane. The whiskey loosened her tongue and sharpened her senses until she found herself leaning closer, drawn by his magnetic presence and the way he looked at her, as if she were the most fascinating person he had encountered in centuries rather than decades. When he suggested they continue their conversation somewhere more private, Sophia felt the last vestiges of her old self dissolve like sugar in rain. Tonight, she would not be the marketing coordinator who color-coded her calendar and believed in fairy tale endings. Tonight, she would be dangerous and reckless and beautiful, the kind of woman who disappeared into penthouse suites with mysterious strangers and emerged transformed. As they walked toward the elevator, her reflection in the polished doors showed someone she barely recognized, her dark hair wild from the rain, her black dress clinging like liquid shadow, her eyes bright with the fever of destruction and rebirth. The elevator carried them upward past floors of sleeping guests, toward whatever waited in the darkness above, and Sophia felt herself ascending not just through space, but through possibility itself, leaving behind the broken fragments of who she had been for the intoxicating unknown of who she might become. The vampire king stood beside her in perfect stillness, and though she did not yet know his true nature, some primal part of her recognized the predator in her presence and found herself thrilled rather than terrified by the proximity to something far more dangerous than a cheating boyfriend or corporate politics. The doors opened onto a private foyer that spoke of wealth beyond her comprehension, and Sophia Chen stepped forward into her new life without looking back. The penthouse stretched before them like a cathedral of glass and shadow, occupying the top 3 floors of the building with floor-to-ceiling windows that transformed the city's glittering sprawl into a living constellation of light and ambition. Sophia had expected awkward small talk, nervous laughter, perhaps the fumbling uncertainty that usually accompanied encounters between strangers. But Damien's presence filled the vast space like smoke, intoxicating and dangerous, making the air itself seem charged with electricity. He moved through the rooms with the casual ownership of someone who had never questioned his right to occupy beautiful spaces, his footsteps silent on marble floors that gleamed like black mirrors under the ambient lighting. The furniture spoke of wealth so profound it had transcended mere luxury to become art, each piece carefully chosen not for comfort, but for the way it caught and reflected light, creating an environment that felt more like a throne room than a home. When he poured wine from a bottle that bore no label, the liquid caught the city lights like captured starlight, tasting of midnight and promises she had never imagined making. He asked no questions about her tears, the ones that had dried on her cheeks during the elevator ride but left salt trails like evidence of her earlier devastation, instead offering her silence and space to exist without explanation or justification. The first touch came as she stood before the windows, watching traffic move like blood cells through the city's arteries far below, his fingers tracing the line of her collarbone with a coldness that should have warned her, but instead sent shivers of anticipation cascading down her spine like electricity seeking ground. His skin felt like marble touched by winter air, beautiful and unyielding, yet when his lips followed the path his fingers had mapped, heat bloomed between them, that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with hunger she had never experienced before. The sex was unlike anything in her limited experience with Marcus's predictable routines and careful consideration for her comfort. This was consumption and surrender, intensity that bordered on violence yet never crossed the line into pain, as if he were drinking her very essence through skin that seemed to burn and freeze simultaneously. She lost track of time and space, aware only of his hands that seemed to know her body better than she knew it herself, his mouth that tasted of wine and darkness, his voice speaking words in languages she did not recognize, but which seemed to resonate in her bones like ancient music. When exhaustion finally claimed her, she fell asleep against his chest, her ear pressed to skin that should have carried a heartbeat, but instead thrummed with something deeper and more primal, missing entirely the way their reflection failed to appear in the darkened windows that surrounded them like mirrors, reflecting only her solitary form. Morning arrived with cruel brightness, sunlight streaming through windows that had seemed so romantic in darkness, but now revealed the stark reality of her situation. As Sophia woke alone in silk sheets, worth more than her monthly salary, their thread count so high they felt like liquid against her skin. The space beside her held no warmth, no impression of the man who had occupied it with such commanding presence just hours before, as if he had simply evaporated with the dawn, like a fever dream, too intense to survive contact with reality. On the nightstand lay a note written on stationery so expensive the paper seemed to glow with its own inner light. The handwriting elegant and precise as calligraphy, reading simply, "Thank you for a memorable evening," followed by the initials DB in script that suggested centuries of practice with formal correspondence. The letters meant nothing to her, just two consonants that could belong to anyone, though something about their careful formation suggested this was not the first such note their author had penned to women who had shared his bed for a single night. Coffee arrived via room service she had not ordered, wheeled in by a uniformed attendant who moved with the reverent efficiency of someone serving royalty, accompanied by fresh clothes in her exact size that had somehow materialized overnight as if conjured from her specific measurements and personal style preferences. The precision unnerved her more than the luxury, suggesting a level of preparation and forethought that transformed what she had believed was spontaneous passion into something far more calculated and deliberate. As she dressed in clothes that fit perfectly, despite being completely unfamiliar, she noticed details that had escaped her attention in the wine-hazed darkness of the previous evening. The family crest etched into everything from door handles to glassware, a raven with spread wings clutching a crown and talons that seemed sharp enough to draw blood even rendered in precious metals. The symbolism felt ancient and ominous, speaking of power that stretched back through generations rather than the nouveau riche ostentation she had initially assumed, and when she finally made her way to the elevator, the operator's bow seemed too formal, too reverent, as if he were greeting nobility rather than dismissing a one-night stand. Something about the entire penthouse had felt like a throne room disguised as a residence, every detail designed to remind visitors of their place in a hierarchy they did not fully understand. Monday morning descended upon sterling marketing like a storm front, the weekend's events still processing in Sophia's mind like a computer struggling to decode corrupted data, her body carrying sense memories of hands that had mapped her skin with supernatural precision and lips that had tasted of wine and danger. The familiar fluorescent lighting felt harsh after the amber elegance of the hotel bar, the beige carpeting and motivational posters suddenly seeming like props in a play about mediocrity after experiencing luxury that redefined her understanding of what money could buy. Her boss, Helen Matthews, called an emergency meeting about their biggest client acquisition in company history, her voice pitched with the nervous excitement of someone who had spent her entire career dreaming of landing an account that could transform their small firm into a major player in the marketing world. The conference room filled with nervous energy as employees whispered about Blackthorn Industries and their mysterious CEO, who conducted all meetings after sunset, who had never been photographed for business publications, whose company had somehow amassed a fortune that rivaled tech giants, despite operating in sectors that seemed almost deliberately obscure. When the elevator doors opened with their familiar mechanical chime, Marcus stepped out first, beaming with the satisfaction of someone whose carefully laid plans had finally achieved fruition, wearing a new company polo in deep charcoal that probably cost more than most people's monthly clothing budget. His hair was perfectly styled, his posture radiating the confidence that came from believing he had successfully manipulated his way into a position of power and influence. And for a moment, Sophia felt the familiar stab of betrayal, fresh as an open wound. But then a figure emerged from the elevator behind him, and every thought in her head evaporated like dew under summer sun as Damien Blackthorne stepped into the conference room, wearing a charcoal suit that transformed him from mysterious stranger into corporate royalty. The fabric moved with him like liquid shadow, tailored with European precision that spoke of craftsmanship, handed down through generations of exclusive tailors who served only the most elite clientele, and his presence immediately commanded the room's attention with the gravitational pull of genuine authority. His eyes found her across the crowded space with the precision of a predator identifying prey, and his slight smile held secrets that made her blood freeze in her veins as recognition crashed over her like a tsunami of impossible coincidence. This was not some random encounter between strangers seeking solace in anonymous passion. This was something far more complex and dangerous, a web of connections she had stumbled into without understanding the rules or the stakes involved. The meeting proceeded like carefully choreographed theater, with Damien commanding the room through quiet authority that made everyone lean forward to catch his softly spoken observations about market penetration and consumer psychology, while Marcus scrambled to impress his new boss with presentations about synergistic opportunities and innovative approaches to brand integration. Sophia watched in paralyzed fascination as the man who had traced fire down her spine just days before discussed quarterly projections with the same intensity he had brought to mapping her body, his voice carrying the same hypnotic cadence that had whispered endearments in languages she could not identify. When Damien's gaze landed on her during Marcus's enthusiastic pitch about their top talent and innovative team members, his expression revealed nothing beyond polite professional interest, yet something in his pale gray eyes suggested layers of meaning that made her skin prickle with awareness and dread in equal measure. Marcus gestured toward her with proprietary pride, clearly believing that his association with Sophia somehow enhanced his own value in his new employer's estimation, his voice taking on the confident tone of someone who believed he was showcasing a particularly valuable asset. But when Damien requested a private consultation with Ms. Chen to discuss the marketing strategy moving forward, suggesting that her particular insights might prove valuable to their upcoming campaigns, Marcus's face went white as fresh snow, his confident smile faltering as power shifted like mercury across glass, flowing away from him and toward forces he could not control or comprehend. The room held its breath as hierarchy rearranged itself around this quiet request, and Sophia realized that whatever game she had stumbled into by seeking revenge against her cheating ex-boyfriend, The rules were far more complex and the stakes far higher than anything she had imagined possible in her small world of corporate politics and personal betrayals. The borrowed office felt like a courtroom waiting for verdict, its generic corporate furnishings transformed into instruments of judgment under the weight of silence that stretched between them like a wire about to snap, tension so thick it seemed to vibrate in the recycled air, while fluorescent lights hummed overhead with mechanical indifference to the supernatural drama unfolding beneath their sterile glow. Damien stood behind the temporary desk with the stillness of carved marble, his charcoal suit immaculate despite the day's meetings, his pale gray eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her skin crawl with the certainty that everything she believed about their encounter had been built on foundations of sand and self-deception. He didn't apologize for the deception, didn't offer explanations wrapped in gentle lies or convenient half-truths, instead reaching into his jacket with deliberate precision to withdraw an object that seemed to pulse with its own dark energy, an ancient leather journal bound with what looked like human hair and secured with clasps that had tarnished to the color of old blood. The book landed on the desk between them with a sound like bones breaking, its cover worn smooth by centuries of handling, marked with symbols that hurt her eyes to look at directly, as if they contained meanings too vast and terrible for mortal comprehension. When he opened the journal, the pages seemed to whisper secrets in languages that predated civilization, their parchment surface covered in handwriting that shifted between scripts and centuries, documenting existence that stretched back through ages when the world was younger and darker and filled with things that still moved in shadows between human understanding and nightmare reality. The entries detailed vampire covens that had risen and fallen like empires, territorial wars fought in back alleys and boardrooms with equal brutality, the delicate balance maintained between the supernatural world that fed on humanity and the human society that remained blissfully ignorant of the predators that walked among them, wearing faces of beauty and charm. Names flowed across the pages in elegant script, some familiar from history books as titans of industry and political power, others completely unknown, yet carrying the weight of influence that shaped economies and toppled governments through methods that would never appear in any official record or investigative report. "Your boyfriend," Damien said, his voice cutting through her shock like a blade through silk, "has been embezzling funds and selling corporate secrets to parties who should never have access to information about supernatural operations disguised as legitimate business ventures." The words hit her like physical blows, each syllable precisely enunciated with the authority of someone accustomed to delivering verdicts that altered the fundamental nature of reality for those who heard them. Marcus Rivera, the man she had shared her bed and her dreams with for 2 years, had been systematically stealing from Sterling Marketing while using his access to client files to identify patterns that revealed the hidden supernatural economy operating parallel to the human world, selling intelligence about vampire-controlled corporations and their security protocols to rivals who would use such information to wage war through hostile takeovers and economic manipulation, rather than the ancient methods of fang and claw. "I was investigating Sterling Marketing when you," Damien continued with clinical detachment, that transformed their night of passion into evidence in a case she had never known was being built, provided an interesting distraction. The journal's final entries, written in handwriting she now recognized as his own flowing script, described Marcus's crimes in damning detail, bank transfers that followed suspicious patterns, encrypted communications with known enemies of vampire society, financial records that revealed a systematic campaign to identify and compromise supernatural assets hidden within seemingly mundane corporate structures. Every romantic gesture Marcus had made, every intimate conversation about her work and her colleagues, every casual question about Sterling Marketing's client base, had been calculated reconnaissance designed to map the vulnerabilities of an organization he had correctly identified as connected to powers far older and more dangerous than human law could touch. The revelation crashed over her like ice water, washing away the last vestiges of the fantasy she had constructed around their weekend encounter, replacing passionate coincidence with the stark reality that she had unknowingly delivered herself to her ex-boyfriend's judge and executioner. Damien had not seduced her out of desire or even opportunistic lust, but had recognized her the moment she walked into that hotel bar as Marcus Rivera's girlfriend, the unwitting key to gaining access to intelligence about the man whose crimes against supernatural society had earned him a death sentence that would be carried out with the same clinical efficiency that characterized everything about the creature standing before her. She had been a tool in an investigation that predated her betrayal by months, possibly years. Her pain and rage and desperate need for revenge, merely convenient emotions that had delivered her into the hands of someone whose concept of justice operated by rules that made human law seem like children's games played with toy weapons. The office walls seemed to close in around her as understanding dawned with the crushing weight of inevitability, the fluorescent lights flickering as if responding to the supernatural tension that filled the space like ozone before a thunderstorm. Every moment of their night together had been performance art designed to extract information she didn't even realize she possessed. Her unconscious knowledge of Marcus's habits and vulnerabilities, cataloged through pillow talk and postcoital conversations that had seemed like intimate bonding, but were actually intelligence gathering of the most sophisticated sort. The wine that had tasted of midnight and promises had been chosen to lower her inhibitions. The touches that had seemed to map her soul were actually reading the emotional landscape that would tell him exactly how to manipulate her grief and anger into useful cooperation. The pleasure that had felt like transcendence was merely a vampire's supernatural ability to enhance human sensation, until reality became indistinguishable from narcotic euphoria. She stared at the journal's open pages, watching words shift and rearrange themselves as if the book were alive, responding to her presence with malevolent intelligence that seemed to mock her naivety in believing that someone like Damien Blackthorne could have been drawn to someone like her through anything as simple as attraction or chance encounter. The symbols burned themselves into her vision, creating after-images that pulsed with each heartbeat, and she realized that merely looking at vampire records was changing her on some fundamental level, opening neural pathways that would forever mark her as someone who had glimpsed the machinery that operated behind the comfortable illusions that kept humanity safe in their ignorance. Marcus's betrayal had been personal, cutting deep but ultimately survivable, the sort of wound that time and distance could heal. But this revelation carved away pieces of her identity that could never be restored, transforming her from victim to unwitting accomplice, to pawn in games whose rules were written in blood and enforced by creatures who measured time in centuries rather than heartbeats. The worst part was the mathematical precision of it all, the way every element had been calculated to achieve maximum effectiveness with minimum risk, her emotions and desires reduced to variables in an equation that had been solved before she ever entered that hotel bar. Damien had known exactly what she would do when faced with Marcus's infidelity, had probably orchestrated the timing of her discovery to ensure she would be in the precise emotional state required to make the choices that would deliver her into his hands, her pain and rage as carefully manipulated as any other tool in his arsenal of seduction and control. Even her decision to wear the black cocktail dress had been anticipated, part of a psychological profile that revealed how thoroughly she had been studied and catalogued, her personality dissected by someone who had been practicing the art of human manipulation since before her great-grandparents had been born. The silence returned, heavier now with the weight of truth that could never be unlearned, and Sophia realized that whatever happened next, she could never return to the comfortable ignorance that had defined her existence just days before. She had seen too much, learned too much, become too entangled in a world where human concepts of justice and morality were merely quaint suggestions rather than absolute laws, where creatures that looked like beautiful men and women played games of power and survival that would continue long after her bones had turned to dust. Marcus's crimes had made him a target for elimination, but her knowledge of those crimes had made her something far more dangerous in vampire society, a loose end that could unravel centuries of carefully maintained secrecy if left to wander free with information that could expose the supernatural world to human scrutiny and potential retaliation. The revelation that Blackthorn Industries served as a front for supernatural oversight in the human world hit Sophia like a physical blow, transforming everything she thought she understood about corporate hierarchy and business ethics into elaborate theatrical performance designed to hide operations that spanned centuries and influenced the fundamental structure of civilization itself. Damien moved to the window with fluid grace, his reflection absent from the glass as he gestured toward the city sprawling below them like a living circuit board, explaining how vampire-controlled corporations maintained the delicate balance between supernatural needs and human ignorance through carefully orchestrated economic manipulation that kept both species fed, while preventing the kind of discovery that would lead to war neither side could truly win. Marcus wasn't just a cheating boyfriend seeking professional advancement, Damien continued with the clinical detachment of someone reading medical diagnoses. He had been trafficking information that endangered both communities, selling intelligence about vampire operations to rival factions who would use such knowledge to destabilize the careful equilibrium that had taken millennia to establish and maintain through blood and sacrifice and endless political maneuvering. Security footage appeared on the office's wall-mounted screen with crystal clarity, showing Marcus in expensive restaurants and hotel lobbies, meeting with individuals whose faces seemed to shift and blur whenever the camera tried to focus on their features, their inhuman nature evident in the way shadows bent around them and electronics malfunctioned in their presence. The conversations were conducted in hushed tones over wine that gleamed like liquid rubies, briefcases changing hands with the efficiency of arms dealers, encrypted hard drives containing decades of carefully compiled intelligence about Blackthorn's security protocols, financial networks, and the identities of supernatural assets embedded within human society. Each meeting represented another layer of betrayal that went far deeper than simple infidelity, revealing Marcus as someone who had systematically compromised the safety of an entire hidden civilization for monetary gain that seemed pathetically small compared to the cosmic consequences his actions would inevitably unleash if left unchecked. Sophia realized with dawning horror that her 2-year relationship had been an elaborate lie designed to gain access to Sterling Marketing's client files. Every intimate moment calculated reconnaissance, every shared meal and whispered endearment carefully orchestrated theater performed by someone who viewed her not as a human being worthy of love, but as a resource to be exploited for the intelligence she could unknowingly provide about supernatural operations disguised as legitimate business ventures. Her knowledge of Sterling's clients, gleaned through casual office conversations and late-night work sessions, had been systematically harvested through pillow talk and domestic conversations that she had believed represented genuine interest in her professional life, but were actually sophisticated intelligence-gathering operations, conducted by someone who had been trained to extract information through emotional manipulation and sexual intimacy. Elena materialized in the office doorway, like smoke given form, her silver hair catching fluorescent light in ways that made it seem to move independently of any earthly wind, her pale eyes fixed on Sophia with the calculating intensity of a scientist studying a particularly interesting specimen under laboratory conditions. The enforcer's presence filled the room with ozone and electrical tension, her antiquated clothing suggesting centuries of existence, while her predatory grace spoke of violence refined into art form through endless practice on victims who had discovered vampire secrets and lived just long enough to regret their curiosity. When she spoke, Her voice carried accents that predated modern language, words carefully chosen to convey meaning that operated on multiple levels simultaneously, making it clear that she viewed Sophia as a liability whose continued existence posed unacceptable risks to supernatural security, regardless of whatever temporary usefulness she might possess as a source of information about Marcus's criminal network. Marcus grew suspicious of Sophia's sudden confidence, with the paranoid instincts of someone whose criminal activities had trained him to recognize when surveillance patterns shifted around him, his texts and phone calls taking on increasingly desperate tones as he demanded explanations for behavior changes he couldn't understand or control. He started following her with the clumsy persistence of amateur stalker, appearing at her favorite coffee shop with newspapers he pretended to read while watching her over expensive sunglasses, lurking outside her apartment building in rental cars that changed daily, but couldn't disguise his growing desperation to understand what had transformed his compliant ex-girlfriend into someone who moved through the world with newfound purpose and dangerous knowledge. Vivian joined the surveillance with professional efficiency that suggested training beyond normal corporate espionage, their combined paranoia fueling increasingly dangerous speculation about what Sophia might know and how much of their operation had been compromised by her unexpected connection to forces they had spent years trying to infiltrate and destroy. Meanwhile, Damien assigned discreet protection that manifested as shadows that followed her home with supernatural stealth, ensuring her safety while gathering evidence of Marcus's criminal network through methods that operated beyond human understanding of surveillance and investigation. Sophia found herself trapped between worlds, the supernatural danger she had stumbled into pressing against her consciousness, like storm clouds gathering on psychological horizons, while the very human threats from her past circled with predatory intent that grew more focused and dangerous with each passing day. Sleep became impossible as she felt eyes watching from darkness, her apartment no longer a sanctuary, but a stage where multiple audiences observed her every movement for signs of weakness or knowledge that could be exploited, eliminated, or transformed into weapons against enemies she was only beginning to comprehend. The summons came through channels that bypassed normal communication entirely, Elena's voice speaking directly into Sophia's mind, with words that tasted of copper and ancient stone, commanding her presence at a midnight gathering in Blackthorn Industries' sub-basement where vampire law would determine her fate according to precedents established when humanity still believed the world was flat and monsters were merely stories told to frighten children into obedience. The building after dark transformed into something that bore no resemblance to the corporate facade it presented during daylight hours. Elevators descending past floors that didn't exist on architectural plans, corridors stretching into distances that violated the fundamental laws of physics and geometry, while shadows moved with independent purpose along walls carved from stone that predated the city above by millennia. Ancient vampires emerged from darkness with the slow deliberation of forces of nature awakening from geological slumber, their eyes reflecting centuries of accumulated power and wisdom that made human civilization seem like a brief flicker of candlelight in an eternal night that stretched backward through time to when their kind had walked among gods and titans, rather than hiding among mortals who forgot their existence the moment sunrise banished shadows to their appointed corners. They debated Sophia's fate in archaic languages that hurt her ears with their otherworldly consonants and vowels, words that seemed to bypass normal hearing to resonate directly in her bones, while air grew thick with the weight of decisions that would echo through eternity, regardless of their final verdict. When they switched to crisp English delivered with accents that spanned continents and centuries, the conversation became a judicial proceeding where her life was evidence to be weighed rather than a precious thing worthy of preservation for its own sake. Some viewed her as a security risk, who knew too much about supernatural operations to be safely released back into human society, their arguments delivered with the logical precision of mathematical theorems that brooked no emotional consideration or appeal to mercy, while others saw potential value in her connection to Marcus that could be exploited to gather intelligence about rival factions and their plans for destabilizing the delicate balance that kept both species from open warfare that would devastate civilization itself. Damien argued for her protection with the passionate intensity of someone defending principles that transcended personal attachment. But vampire law was clear as crystal and twice as sharp. Its precedents established through centuries of careful jurisprudence designed to protect supernatural society from discovery and destruction by forces that would show no mercy to creatures they viewed as parasitic threats to human dominance of the planet. Mortals who discovered their world through accident or investigation faced only three possible fates, each carrying consequences that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of their existence in ways that could never be reversed or undone, regardless of their personal wishes or human concepts of justice and individual rights. They could be turned, transformed through blood and ritual, into creatures who would spend eternity serving vampire society with the absolute loyalty that came from sharing their nature and understanding their vulnerabilities, their human lives ending in exchange for immortal servitude that made them simultaneously more and less than they had been, as mortals walking in ignorant bliss through a world they had never truly understood. They could be bound by mystical contracts that would tie their fate to supernatural oversight for the remainder of their natural lives, magical compulsions ensuring their silence while restricting their freedom to levels that made prisons seem like vacation destinations by comparison, their memories selectively modified to remove dangerous knowledge, while leaving them functional enough to serve as assets in ongoing operations against enemies who threatened vampire interests. Or they could be eliminated with the clinical efficiency that characterized all vampire justice, their deaths staged to appear like accidents or crimes that human authorities would investigate, and close without ever discovering the supernatural motives behind murders that removed security risks with surgical precision, while sending carefully calculated messages to anyone else who might be tempted to dig too deeply into matters that were better left buried in darkness and forgotten, like bad dreams that fade with morning light. The court gave Sophia 3 days to prove her usefulness to supernatural society, 72 hours to demonstrate value that outweighed the risks posed by her knowledge and her connection to enemies who had already proven their willingness to sacrifice anything and anyone to achieve their goals of exposing vampire civilization to human scrutiny and potential annihilation. The deadline hung over her like a blade suspended by threads that grew thinner with each heartbeat. Time measured not in minutes and hours, but in opportunities to transform herself from liability into asset before patience expired, and vampire justice rendered its final verdict with the inexorable certainty of natural law. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. Sophia chose to help bring down Marcus's operation with the grim determination of someone who had finally understood that running away would only delay the inevitable confrontation with forces too powerful and far-reaching to escape through simple geography or willful ignorance, her decision crystallizing during the sleepless hours after the vampire court's ultimatum, when she realized that her former life had already died, the moment she learned the truth about the supernatural world operating in shadows around human civilization. Working with Damien's supernatural resources felt like learning to operate advanced technology while blindfolded, each protective spell and communication charm requiring her to accept concepts that violated everything she had believed about reality, while trusting her life to magic that operated according to principles her rational mind rejected, even as her survival instincts recognized their necessity. They devised a plan that walked the razor's edge between exposing Marcus's crimes to appropriate authorities while protecting vampire secrecy through carefully orchestrated misdirection that would allow human law enforcement to prosecute treason and corporate espionage without ever discovering the supernatural elements that made such crimes possible in the first place. Sophia would wear a recording device to Marcus's planned meeting with rival faction leaders. Her role as unwitting bait transformed into conscious participation in an operation that could either save her life or ensure her death, depending on variables too numerous and unpredictable to calculate with any meaningful accuracy. The risk was enormous, mathematical certainty that discovery would result in pursuit by both human authorities who would view her as a terrorist threat and supernatural justice that would eliminate her as a security liability. But the alternative was accepting transformation into something inhuman or spending whatever remained of her natural lifespan under magical compulsions that would make her a prisoner in her own mind while serving masters whose agenda remained incomprehensible to mortal understanding. Damien provided her with protective amulets that felt warm against her skin, despite being crafted from metals that had never seen sunlight. Communication spells that allowed her to send distress signals through methods that bypassed electronic surveillance while connecting her to backup forces, who moved through shadows like living nightmares seeking targets to eliminate with prejudice and efficiency. But vampire law forbade direct intervention if she was discovered. Ancient precedents that required supernatural justice to maintain plausible deniability when operating in human territory, meaning that once she entered Sterling Marketing's offices for the confrontation, she would be entirely alone with whatever courage and cunning she could muster against enemies who had spent lifetimes perfecting the art of violence and deception. The weight of isolation pressed against her consciousness like deep ocean pressure, knowing that success or failure would depend entirely on her ability to improvise and survive in situations where a single mistake would result in consequences that extended far beyond personal death, to include exposure of vampire society and the kind of interspecies war that would reduce human civilization to archaeological evidence for whatever species inherited a planet stripped of its current dominant inhabitants. The meeting took place in Sterling Marketing's offices after hours, fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across familiar spaces that had been transformed into stages for supernatural theater, where the price of poor performance was measured in lives rather than quarterly profits, with Marcus believing he was selling Damien's personal schedule and security details to buyers whose true nature remained hidden behind human faces that served as masks for creatures whose hunger extended far beyond mere monetary compensation. Sophia arrived early through service entrances that Damien's people had mapped and compromised, hiding recording equipment in locations that balanced audio quality against the risk of discovery, while preparing herself psychologically for confrontation with the man whose betrayal had set in motion the chain of events that had destroyed her comfortable ignorance and replaced it with knowledge that felt like acid burning through the comfortable lies that had defined her existence for 26 years. When Marcus and Vivian appeared with three mysterious figures whose eyes reflected light like animals caught in headlights, their inhuman nature barely concealed beneath expensive suits and designer accessories that failed to disguise predatory grace and movements that operated according to physics that didn't apply to normal human physiology, Sophia realized with dawning horror that she was in deeper than anyone had anticipated. The buyers weren't just rival vampires seeking competitive advantage through corporate espionage and financial manipulation. They were supernatural assassins whose purpose extended far beyond information gathering to include the elimination of targets whose continued existence posed threats to plans that spanned decades and required Damien's death to proceed without supernatural interference from someone whose power and influence could destabilize carefully laid foundations with a single well-placed command or strategic alliance. Marcus had unknowingly arranged his boss's murder through hubris and greed that blinded him to the true nature of forces he had been manipulating, his human perspective insufficient to recognize that selling scheduling information about a vampire king was equivalent to providing blueprints for an assassination that would trigger supernatural war with consequences that would extend far beyond the corporate world into realms where ancient grudges and territorial disputes were settled through methods that made human warfare seem like children's games played with toy weapons. The recording device captured everything with digital precision that would provide irrefutable evidence of treason and conspiracy. Marcus's detailed knowledge of Damien's supernatural nature flowing through conversations that revealed months of careful observation and intelligence gathering. The assassin's plans discussed with clinical efficiency that treated murder as routine business transaction, and Vivian's role as spy for competing supernatural factions whose agenda involved destabilizing vampire society through targeted elimination of key figures whose deaths would create power vacuums that could be exploited by enemies who had spent centuries planning their revenge against creatures they viewed as usurpers of authority that rightfully belonged to older and more primal supernatural species. But Marcus spotted the equipment with the paranoid awareness of someone whose criminal activities had trained him to recognize surveillance technology, his eyes fixing on the nearly invisible recording device with the laser focus of predator identifying immediate threat, realization dawning across his features like sunrise over battlefield, where the dead lay scattered among the remnants of strategies that had failed catastrophically despite careful planning and superior numbers. Violence erupted with the sudden intensity of summer storm, assassins moving with inhuman speed that turned furniture into weapons and transformed familiar office space into combat zone where every surface became potential cover and every shadow concealed threats that operated beyond normal human understanding of physical limitations and tactical possibilities. Sophia fought desperately with skills she didn't know she possessed, adrenaline and supernatural protection combining to keep her alive through reflexes that seemed to anticipate attacks before conscious thought could process danger. Damien's protective amulets flaring with light that burned supernatural vision while creating barriers of force that deflected claws and fangs designed to tear through human flesh like tissue paper soaked in warm water. The communication spell activated automatically when her heart rate exceeded human maximum, sending distress signals through dimensions that bypassed normal space-time limitations to reach backup forces who responded with the terrible efficiency of supernatural military units trained to eliminate threats without regard for collateral damage or civilian casualties that might complicate cleanup operations designed to maintain the illusion of normal human existence. Elena and vampire security forces stormed the building with the overwhelming force of natural disaster, given tactical focus, their arrival announced by windows that shattered spontaneously and electrical systems that failed in cascade patterns that left the building in darkness, broken only by emergency lighting that cast everything in hellish red glow, reminiscent of battlefield surgery conducted under combat conditions. The supernatural battle's aftermath left Sterling Marketing's offices looking like terrorist attack had occurred, structural damage that would require extensive reconstruction, while forensic evidence suggested chemical explosion rather than the clash between inhuman forces that had actually taken place in spaces where reality had been temporarily suspended to accommodate combat between beings whose nature transcended normal physical limitations. The assassins were captured through methods that left them alive but fundamentally altered, their memories selectively edited to remove knowledge of vampire operations, while leaving them functional enough to serve as examples to other supernatural factions that might consider similar operations against Damien's organization. But Marcus and Vivian escaped into the night with survival instincts that suggested professional training in evasion techniques that allowed them to disappear into urban landscape like smoke dissipating in wind that carried no trace of their passage or destination. Their escape represented more than simple fugitive status, transforming them into ongoing threats whose knowledge of vampire operations made them valuable assets for enemies who would use such intelligence to plan future attacks against supernatural society, while providing them with resources and protection that would make conventional law enforcement efforts completely ineffective. With their supernatural enemies exposed through evidence that could never be presented in human courts without revealing the existence of vampire society, Damien's organization launched a citywide manhunt that operated according to rules that made conventional law enforcement seem quaint and inefficient by comparison. Their methods, including surveillance networks that spanned multiple dimensions and tracking techniques that followed psychic residue, invisible to human perception, but clear as highway signs to supernatural senses, trained to hunt prey across vast distances, and through temporal distortions that confused normal investigation protocols. Police reports described a gas leak explosion at Sterling Marketing with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that suggested official cooperation with cover-up operations designed to prevent human authorities from investigating incidents that involved supernatural activity. Media coverage carefully managed to ensure public attention focused on corporate safety violations rather than evidence of non-human involvement in what appeared to be industrial accident, with surprisingly minimal casualties given the extent of structural damage. Sophia realized with crystalline clarity that she could never return to her normal life. Her knowledge of vampire society and involvement in supernatural conflict having marked her as permanently dangerous to the careful balance that kept both species from open warfare, while her enemies in both worlds would view her continued existence as unacceptable threat to their respective agendas, regardless of any protection Damien might provide through resources that were vast but not infinite, when deployed against enemies whose patience was measured in centuries rather than human lifespans. Damien offered her sanctuary in his penthouse while they tracked the fugitives, the same space where their relationship had begun through deception and manipulation, now serving as fortress against forces that sought her elimination through methods that ranged from simple assassination to complex psychological warfare, designed to drive her insane before killing her in ways that would appear like suicide or accident to human investigators. Their growing intimacy complicated everything, with emotions that felt genuine despite the supernatural circumstances that had brought them together. Her rational mind, recognizing that falling for a vampire king whose world operated by rules that could destroy her, was probably the most dangerous thing she could do, while her heart responded to kindness and protection that felt more real than anything she had experienced in her relationship with Marcus, whose every gesture of affection had been calculated theater performed for audience of one who had never suspected she was watching elaborate fraud designed to exploit her trust and emotional vulnerability for intelligence that would be used to wage war against creatures she hadn't known existed until circumstances forced her to choose between ignorance and survival in a world where knowledge itself could be a death sentence. Marcus and Vivian were captured trying to flee the country with stolen vampire intelligence worth more than most nations' annual budgets. Their desperate attempt to reach safe haven thwarted by supernatural tracking methods that operated beyond human understanding of time and space, reducing their carefully planned escape route to inevitable collision with forces that had been hunting them across multiple dimensions while they fumbled through airport security with fake passports that might have fooled human authorities but were transparent as glass to creatures who could read the psychic residue of deception in their very souls. The supernatural court convened for their judgment with the terrible majesty of natural forces awakening from slumber. Ancient vampires emerging from shadows that seemed to pulse with otherworldly energy, while Sophia found herself standing as witness in proceedings that followed laws older than civilization itself, her testimony about their crimes against both human and vampire law carrying weight that transformed her from victim to active participant in justice, that operated according to principles that made mortal jurisprudence seem like children's games played with wooden blocks and naive hope. Marcus's betrayal ran deeper than anyone had suspected. Investigation revealing his involvement with a human supremacist group whose existence had been carefully hidden from supernatural society, an organization that sought to expose and eliminate supernatural beings through methods that ranged from political manipulation to outright warfare waged with weapons specifically designed to kill creatures that conventional armaments could barely inconvenience. The evidence presented to the court painted a picture of systematic infiltration that spanned years rather than months. Marcus having been recruited during college by handlers who recognized his potential for accessing supernatural operations through career advancement that would eventually place him in positions where he could gather intelligence about vampire society's hidden infrastructure and security protocols. His relationship with Sophia had been orchestrated from the beginning, his handlers having identified her as someone whose professional connections would eventually provide access to Sterling Marketing's client files, making their entire 2-year relationship an elaborate intelligence operation disguised as romantic partnership. The documents and digital files recovered from their attempted escape revealed a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government and corporate power. Human officials who had been secretly planning genocide against supernatural beings through carefully coordinated exposure campaigns that would turn public opinion against creatures they portrayed as parasitic threats to human dominance of the planet. Military research had been conducted into weapons designed to permanently kill vampires, werewolves, and other supernatural species, while psychological warfare specialists had developed media campaigns that would prime human populations to accept and support systematic extermination once supernatural existence became public knowledge, through carefully orchestrated revelations that would seem like investigative journalism rather than coordinated attacks. His punishment was exile to a remote supernatural prison that existed in dimensions where time moved differently, and escape was literally impossible due to physical laws that operated according to principles that made conventional incarceration seem like vacation resort by comparison. His human lifespan extended through magical means to ensure he would serve centuries rather than decades in confinement, that would give him ample opportunity to contemplate the consequences of betraying creatures whose concept of justice was measured in geological time rather than legal precedent. Vivian faced memory modification and constant surveillance, her mind selectively edited to remove knowledge of supernatural operations, while leaving her functional enough to serve as early warning system should other human supremacist groups attempt similar infiltration. Her consciousness permanently monitored by magical compulsions that would alert vampire security if she ever encountered information that might trigger recovery of her suppressed memories. Justice felt hollow compared to the simple revenge Sophia had originally sought when her greatest concern had been a cheating boyfriend, rather than existential threats to multiple species. The cosmic scope of Marcus's crimes reducing her personal betrayal to footnote in conspiracy that could have triggered interspecies war with casualties measured in millions, rather than the broken heart she had been nursing when this entire nightmare began. The elaborate supernatural trial with its ancient protocols and otherworldly consequences bore no resemblance to the satisfaction she had imagined when planning her night of spite and seduction, reality proving far more complex and dangerous than the romantic drama she had constructed around her wounded pride and desire for emotional vindication against someone whose infidelity had seemed like the worst thing that could possibly happen to her comfortable suburban existence. With the immediate threat resolved through imprisonment and exile that removed Marcus and Vivian from the board permanently, Sophia faced her ultimate decision, with the weight of vampire law requiring her to choose between 3 options that would each fundamentally alter the trajectory of her existence in ways that could never be reversed, regardless of future regret or changing circumstances that might make her original choice seem tragically misguided. She could undergo the turning to become Damien's immortal partner, transformation through blood and ritual that would grant her eternal life at the cost of her essential humanity, making her simultaneously more and less than she had been, while binding her fate to supernatural society forever through physiological changes that would alter her perception of reality and relationship with mortal existence. She could accept magical binding that would tie her fate to the supernatural world while allowing her to remain human, a compromise that offered extended lifespan and enhanced abilities while requiring absolute loyalty to vampire law and permanent separation from the normal human life she had known before discovering the truth about creatures that moved through shadows between mundane reality and nightmare possibility. Or she could have her memories modified to remove all knowledge of supernatural existence and return to normal human life with carefully implanted false recollections that would explain the missing time and emotional trauma while allowing her to resume her interrupted career and relationships without the burden of knowledge that could destroy her sanity if she tried to share it with friends and family who would never believe such impossible truths about the world they thought they understood. Each option carried enormous costs that would echo through whatever remained of her existence, turning representing death of her human identity in exchange for immortal servitude to beings whose moral framework operated according to principles that might eventually require her to participate in activities that her current ethical system would find abhorrent, while binding meant living half in and half out of the supernatural world without fully belonging to either community that would shape her future development. Memory modification meant losing Damien and everything they had shared during the most intense and transformative period of her life, their relationship reduced to blank space in her consciousness, where love and terror and wonder would be replaced by artificial memories designed to provide psychological stability rather than emotional truth, making their growing intimacy and mutual dependence irrelevant to a future where she would never remember his touch or the way his presence had awakened possibilities she had never imagined existing within her previously mundane existence. The choice must be made before the next new moon, supernatural law requiring decisive action within time frame that felt simultaneously too short for such momentous decision and too long to endure the psychological pressure of knowing that her entire future hung in balance while enemies who might have escaped detection continued to plot against both her and the vampire society that had become her unlikely protector. Sophia chose the binding ritual with the desperate courage of someone who had finally understood that safety was illusion, and that the only meaningful choice was between different forms of risk, rather than between danger and security, that could never be guaranteed in a world where supernatural forces operated. According to agenda that extended far beyond human comprehension or control. Accepting magical ties to Damien's world while remaining human felt like walking tightrope suspended over abyss, but it offered the possibility of love and purpose that transcended her previous existence while avoiding the complete dissolution of identity that turning would require, and the hollow emptiness that memory modification would create through artificial ignorance that might protect her sanity, but would rob her of the most profound experiences of her life. The ceremony took place at midnight in Blackthorn Industries' rooftop garden that had been transformed into sacred space through ritual preparation that involved carving ancient runes into stone circles whose geometry hurt her eyes with their otherworldly precision, symbols that seemed to pulse with their own inner light while creating patterns that extended beyond normal three-dimensional space into realms where mathematics became magic and intention shaped reality through forces that operated according to principles that predated human understanding of physics and causality. Elena presided over vows that echoed through dimensions, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated in frequencies beyond normal human hearing, while wine that touched no earthly atmosphere stirred her silver hair with currents that brought sense of places that existed only in legends and nightmares of beings whose dreams were reality and whose reality was dream. Sophia gained enhanced senses that revealed layers of existence she had never suspected, vision that could penetrate supernatural disguises while hearing that detected conversations conducted in frequencies that normal humans couldn't perceive, touch that could feel magical energies flowing through people and objects, like electricity seeking ground, while taste and smell provided information about the emotional and spiritual states of supernatural beings who moved through the world wearing masks of normalcy that concealed natures that operated according to entirely different biological and metaphysical principles. Extended lifespan meant centuries rather than decades to explore the implications of her enhanced perception while serving as bridge between human and vampire communities that would increasingly depend on her unique perspective to maintain the delicate balance that kept both species from warfare that would devastate civilization, regardless of which side eventually claimed victory through methods that would make historical conflicts seem like playground disputes between children arguing over toys. In return, she pledged to protect vampire secrets with magical compulsions that made betrayal literally impossible, while serving as liaison between human and supernatural communities, whose conflicting needs and agenda would require constant negotiation and compromise to prevent misunderstandings that could escalate into violence that would threaten the careful stability that had been achieved through centuries of careful diplomacy and mutual accommodation. Damien's kiss sealed the bond with power that flowed between them like current completing circuit, their futures intertwined across the centuries that stretched ahead like uncharted territory, where love and duty and survival would merge into single imperative that would define their existence together, while the city sprawled below them like living organism, whose heartbeats synchronized with their own as magic worked its ancient transformation upon flesh and spirit that would never again be purely human or entirely separate from the supernatural forces that shaped reality, from shadows where ordinary people never looked and never suspected that their comfortable world was maintained through constant vigilance by creatures whose sacrifices remained forever hidden from the very people they protected, through methods that required absolute secrecy to remain effective against enemies who would never stop seeking ways to destroy the delicate peace that made civilization possible for both species, sharing a planet that was large enough for coexistence, but small enough that conflict would leave nowhere to hide from the consequences of hatred and fear, and the terrible arithmetic of revenge that multiplied suffering across generations. Until someone found courage to break cycles of violence through choices that required more strength than warfare and more wisdom than weapons could ever provide to species learning to share space in universe where survival depended on cooperation rather than conquest. 6 months after the binding ceremony that had transformed her from ordinary marketing executive into supernatural liaison between species whose coexistence depended on careful diplomacy and mutual understanding that required constant maintenance, Sophia worked as Damien's official representative to human corporations, with her enhanced perception, allowing her to identify potential security threats while her marketing background provided perfect cover for managing Blackthorn Industries' expanding influence through legitimate business practices that concealed operations designed to maintain the delicate balance between vampire society and human civilization. Her new abilities manifested in subtle ways that made her extraordinarily effective at reading corporate executives whose surface thoughts revealed hidden agendas and concealed hostilities, while her extended lifespan meant she could invest decades in building relationships that would protect supernatural interests through patient cultivation of human allies who never suspected they were serving as unwitting guardians of species they would never know existed within their carefully maintained ignorance. Marcus remained imprisoned in supernatural detention that existed outside normal spacetime, where his human lifespan had been magically extended to ensure centuries of contemplation about the consequences of betraying creatures, whose concept of justice operated according to principles that made mortal law seem like suggestions rather than absolute commandments. But intelligence gathered through methods that bypassed conventional surveillance suggested other supremacist cells operated throughout the city with funding and coordination that indicated his capture had merely removed one tentacle from organization, whose true scope remained hidden behind layers of compartmentalization and security protocols designed to prevent exactly the kind of exposure that had led to his downfall. The discovery of additional cells meant that Marcus's conspiracy represented systemic threat rather than isolated group of fanatics, requiring ongoing vigilance and countermeasures that would test the limits of vampire resources while forcing supernatural society to acknowledge that human hostility was more widespread and better organized than anyone had previously suspected. Sophia and Damien's relationship had deepened beyond mere supernatural binding into genuine partnership built on shared purpose and mutual respect that transcended the magical compulsions that had initially connected their fates. Their growing intimacy, complicated by power dynamics that required constant negotiation between his ancient authority and her newfound abilities, that made her simultaneously dependent on his protection and essential to his operations in ways that traditional vampire hierarchy had never accommodated. They had found love within the framework of political alliance, their personal connections strengthening their professional effectiveness, while their combined resources provided both human and supernatural communities with unprecedented opportunities for cooperation that could serve as foundation for lasting peace if they could survive the enemies who viewed such cooperation as existential threat to their respective supremacist agendas. When threatening letters arrived at Blackthorn Industries with postmarks from multiple cities and signatures identifying their authors as representatives of something called the Dawn Coalition, Sophia realized with dawning horror that their victory over Marcus's immediate conspiracy had been merely the opening move in a much larger campaign designed to expose and eliminate supernatural beings through coordinated attacks that would make his individual efforts seem like amateur hour compared to professional operations, backed by resources that suggested government involvement and military planning that operated according to strategic principles developed through decades of careful study and preparation. The letters contained information about vampire operations that should have been impossible for human organizations to obtain, details about security protocols and safe house locations that implied infiltration at levels that made Marcus's corporate espionage seem like child's play compared to systematic penetration of supernatural society by enemies who had been preparing for warfare while vampires had been focused on maintaining peaceful coexistence. Her unique position between human and vampire worlds made her both invaluable asset and high-priority target for elimination by forces that recognized her potential to serve as bridge between species, while simultaneously understanding that her existence represented proof that cooperation was possible, and therefore posed fundamental threat to ideologies that required eternal conflict to justify their existence and maintain their political power within both communities. The Dawn Coalition's intelligence network had identified her as key figure, whose elimination would weaken vampire operations, while sending message to other humans who might consider similar cooperation that betrayal of their own kind would result in consequences that extended far beyond personal death, to include systematic targeting of anyone who had ever shown them kindness or support. The next threat materialized through patterns that became visible only when analyzed through combination of human investigative techniques and supernatural perception that could detect magical residue and psychic disturbances that normal methods would never identify, revealing coordinated campaign that operated simultaneously across multiple dimensions of reality while maintaining plausible deniability in purely human terms that would allow Dawn Coalition operatives to function within normal legal and social frameworks without revealing their true agenda to authorities who might attempt to interfere with operations that technically violated no laws while pursuing goals that would ultimately result in genocide if successful. The final confrontation would require resources that neither human nor vampire communities possessed individually, making cooperation not just beneficial, but absolutely essential for survival of both species, in a world where ancient hatred and modern technology had combined to create threats that transcended traditional categories of conflict and resolution. The final scene took place in Damien's penthouse, that had truly become their shared home through gradual accumulation of personal belongings and domestic routines that transformed the space from bachelor vampire's retreat into sanctuary, where two very different beings had learned to build life together despite obstacles that would have seemed insurmountable just months before, when their relationship began. through deception and manipulation that had somehow evolved into partnership based on genuine affection and mutual dependence that neither had expected to develop within magical framework originally designed for political alliance rather than romantic connection. Sophia reviewed intelligence reports while Damien handled supernatural court business through communication methods that operated beyond normal human understanding, their parallel activities representing perfect symbol of their unique position as couple whose personal relationship served larger purposes while their individual responsibilities required them to maintain separate spheres of influence that somehow strengthened rather than weakened their bond. A news broadcast mentioned unusual disappearances among young professionals in the same demographic that Marcus had targeted for recruitment, the missing persons fitting profile of individuals whose education, career trajectories, and psychological characteristics made them ideal candidates for radicalization by groups that sought to exploit their ambition and idealism while channeling their frustration with perceived inequities into hatred directed at supernatural beings who served as convenient scapegoats for complex problems that required more nuanced solutions than simple violence could provide. The disappearances followed geographical pattern that suggested systematic recruitment operation rather than random criminal activity, with missing persons concentrated in areas where supernatural businesses maintained significant presence, while their backgrounds indicated access to information that could prove valuable to organizations planning large-scale operations against vampire society. Elena arrived with disturbing evidence gathered through surveillance techniques that operated beyond human detection capabilities, her silver hair reflecting lamplight with otherworldly beauty, while her expression carried weight of discoveries that would reshape their understanding of threats they faced from enemies whose patience and resources exceeded their most pessimistic estimates about Dawn Coalition capabilities and long-term strategic planning. Someone was building new network using Marcus's research to identify humans susceptible to anti-supernatural propaganda, psychological profiles and recruitment techniques refined through analysis of his successes and failures, while incorporating lessons learned from his capture that would make future operations significantly more difficult to detect and counter through conventional supernatural security measures. The evidence included intercepted communications that revealed recruitment centers disguised as self-help seminars and professional development workshops, psychological conditioning programs that gradually introduced anti-supernatural ideology through carefully crafted narratives that presented vampires and other supernatural beings as parasitic threats to human progress and dignity, while training facilities provided instruction in combat techniques and surveillance methods specifically designed to operate against creatures whose abilities exceeded normal human limitations. The scope of the operation suggested funding and coordination that required government backing or corporate sponsorship at levels that indicated Dawn Coalition had achieved infiltration of major institutions rather than remaining marginalized extremist group operating from society's fringes. The camera pulled back through floor-to-ceiling windows that had witnessed so many pivotal moments in their relationship as Sophia and Damien prepared for their next battle against enemies whose hatred threatened to destroy the careful balance that allowed both species to share a world that was large enough for coexistence, but small enough that conflict would leave nowhere to hide from consequences of violence that would inevitably escalate until one side achieved total victory through methods that would transform survivors into monsters, regardless of which species ultimately claimed dominance over planet, that belonged equally to all beings capable of reason and compassion. The city sprawled beneath them like living chessboard, where ancient powers continued to play games with mortal lives, while new players entered contests whose rules were still being written through blood and sacrifice, and occasional acts of courage that offered hope for future, where cooperation might triumph over conflict through wisdom that transcended species boundaries and ideological divisions that had caused so much unnecessary suffering throughout history. The war for coexistence had only just begun, but they faced it together with resources that neither possessed individually, and determination forged through trials that had tested every aspect of their relationship, while proving that love could survive and flourish, even under circumstances that should have made trust impossible, and partnership inconceivable between beings whose natures seemed fundamentally incompatible until shared danger and mutual dependence revealed underlying compatibility that transcended surface differences to create foundations strong enough to support whatever challenges the future might bring to couple whose personal happiness had become inseparable from survival of civilization itself in world where ancient hatred sought to destroy progress that had taken centuries to achieve through countless small acts of courage by individuals who chose cooperation over conflict despite personal costs that often included everything they had previously valued about their existence.